Joko, yo. There's a woman in Four Oaks, North Carolina, who was born in Berlin. Not the Berlin in Pennsylvania, Berlin in Ontario or Texas or whatever, but not a Berlin anyone around here would recognize unless you've been there. The Berlin. The one that was on fire in 1945, the one that got cut in half by a wall and spent 40 years as the most terrifying intersection on the planet. The place where the Cold War had an address. Now, her name was Sula Hansley, and a few years back, the Johnston County Heritage Center opened an exhibit called Living Under a Mushroom Cloud, the early Cold War years. And they invited her to come and share her story, which means somewhere in Johnston County there's a woman who has lived through things most of us have only seen in documentaries. Today we're not going to tell her story for her. We don't know it well enough, and it deserves better than that. What we're going to do is tell the story of the world she came from, because that world is almost impossible to imagine if you grew up where tobacco fields met the pine forests, and the most dangerous thing in the sky was a summer thunderstorm. And maybe, if this episode finds her way to her or someone that knows her, maybe she'll come sit by a microphone someday. And either way, let's get to it. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, actually at the end, in April 1945, Berlin. The city had been burning for years, Allied bombing raids reducing block after block to rubble. But now the Soviet Red Army was at the gates. 2.5 million civilians were still in the city. Food was nearly gone, water was unreliable, and then the artillery started. The Battle of Berlin lasted from April 16 to May 2nd, 1945. In 16 days, the Red Army fired more artillery shells into Berlin than the United States dropped bombs on Japan in the entire Pacific War. Wow. Block by block, building by building, the city was taken. And what followed was, by every measure, one of the most catastrophic moments in the history of civilian life in the 20th century. Within the 4 occupied sectors of Berlin, approximately 10% of buildings were irreparably destroyed, leaving behind an estimated 55 million cubic meters of rubble to be cleared. 55 million cubic meters. Man, that's a number that doesn't even fit in my human brain. Let's try it another way. Historians calculated that the amount of rubble to be cleared was the equivalent of more than 150 Great Pyramids of Giza, stacked in broken brick and ash across what used to be one of the great cities of the world. And the men were gone, dead, imprisoned, scattered. The number of soldiers killed in battle, together with those missing or imprisoned, led to a significant demographic imbalance in the post-war period. Women outnumbered men 2-1. So it fell to the women. They became known as the Trümmerfrauen, the rebel women. They worked in all weather, organized in columns of 10 to 20 with an average workday of 9 hours and one 20 to 30-minute lunch break. They were paid 72 Reichspfennig per hour, less than $1 a day, and one food ration card, which would feed exactly one person for exactly one day. American journalist Margaret Burke White watched them work in 1945 and wrote that they passed their pails of broken bricks from hand to hand with such slow motion they seemed to be almost in a dream. They were not dreaming, they were surviving. Now here's something that doesn't make it into most tellings of this story, but matters for understanding what Berlin was. In 1945 and 1946, as women cleared rubble by day, a fashion industry was quietly being born at night. Women pulled rags from beneath the debris and stitched them into dresses called Lumpenkleider, or rag dresses, partly for warmth, partly for dignity, and partly because of a sense of normalcy, however threadbare. It was its own form of resistance. Berlin, which would later become one of the fashion capitals of Europe, began its comeback in a pile of ruins with a sewing machine and a handful of salvaged cloth. Man, if you were that person, you belong in Johnston County, because that's just stubborn. In a good way. By 1946, the city was divided, American, British, French, and Soviet sectors all occupying different quadrants of the same broken metropolis. For civilians, this meant navigating a city where the rules changed depending on which block you're on, where the currency was unstable, where the food was rationed, where the political future of everything was genuinely uncertain. And then in 1948, June, it got dramatically worse. The Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' railway, road, and canal access to sectors of Berlin under Western control, the very first major international crisis of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade. Life in West Berlin during the blockade was not easy. Fuel and electricity were rationed, and the black market was the only place to obtain many goods. An airlift, the most ambitious logistical operation in peacetime history, was the Western response. At peak operations, an aircraft landed in West Berlin every 45 seconds around the clock. Planes carrying coal, flour, dried potatoes, medicine, anything that could keep 2 million people alive through a Berlin winter. Apartments were unheated, water was rationed, electricity was available only a few hours daily, yet morale held. There was a saying that circulated in Berlin that winter: "It's cold in Berlin, but it's colder in Siberia." In September 1948, 300,000 West Berliners gathered at the Reichstag to show their opposition to Soviet domination. 300,000 people in a blockaded city in the rubble of a lost war standing up. Man, those guys been through a lot. The blockade lasted 11 months. The Soviets lifted it in May 1949, having accomplished absolutely nothing, except demonstrating to the rest of the world exactly what kind of neighbor they're going to be. Now, how does a woman from that Berlin end up in Four Oaks, North Carolina? I don't know Sula Hansley's specific path, but we do know the paths that were available. Between the years 1942 and 1952, about 1 million American soldiers married foreign women from 50 different countries. By 1950, more than 14,000 German brides of American servicemen had entered the United States. The War Brides Act of 1945 made it possible. Yeah, we had an act called the War Brides Act, cutting through the immigration quotas that would otherwise have kept European women out. These women faced a journey that was in its own way as dramatic as everything they'd already survived. Many tried to conceal their German identity, identifying by their specific region or calling themselves Austrian or Swiss, to avoid the animosity that came with being German in post-war America. They arrived in places they'd never seen, in a language many barely spoke, to live with families that they'd never met, in towns that they couldn't have found on a map. Towns like Four Oaks, North Carolina. Now think about that transition for a moment from the rubble of Berlin, where you grew up watching the sky for bombers, where you learned to read a Soviet sector checkpoint the way a farmer reads weather, where history was not something that happened in textbooks, but something that happened on your street, to Four Oaks. Population 25 when it was founded, cotton and tobacco, the railroad tracks down the middle of town, and the bugs crawling and crying and speaking in August. So what do you do with that? What do you talk about at the feed store? How do you explain to a neighbor over sweet tea on a porch? How do you drink sweet tea when you've never had it? That you once watched an entire city get rebuilt brick by brick by hand. At the opening of the Heritage Center exhibit, Sula Hansley of Four Oaks was present to share stories of her journey from war-torn Berlin to Johnston County. That sentence right there is doing a lot of work. War-torn Berlin, Johnston County. There's an entire life compressed between those two phrases. Years of fear and survival and adaptation and reinvention that most of us will never come close to. Now, the exhibit was called Living Under a Mushroom Cloud, the Early Cold War Years, and that title is exactly right, because the fear that defined Berlin in the late 1940s and 1950s was not just a fear of what had already happened, it was a fear of what might still happen. The Soviet bomb, the next war, the one that couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Now, here's the thing, a lot of us listening to this, and not all, grew up during the Cold War, and I think the Cold War probably hit Miss Hansley a little bit different than it hit me, and maybe you if you're of the same age that I am. I mean, we knew the Cold War was there. We knew that anything could happen. We knew the threats. We heard about it. Some of you listening to this know in the 1950s in a way that I don't, what it was like in the early days. I experienced in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, whenever it was pretty much over. But could you imagine living through World War II, living in Berlin, and you probably are not a Nazi, honestly. The percent of people that were like helpers and worshipers of that particular deadly, awful, satanic even cult, the percent is few. A lot of people are going to see this as this organization that has completely taken over your entire country like a bully, making everyone, submit to it. And then you have to endure a war because this cult of insanity has thrust this war upon you, and you're having to deal with bombs day to day to day for a war that you didn't want. A war against a government that you didn't want, that you didn't support, and you're stuck, and you live it, and you hear and feel and smell the bombs dropping, and now you're in another threat of war, and you've already seen what the Soviets can do with their traditional bombs, and imagine what they can do with nuclear ones. That is terrifying. That's crazy. That fear, it turns out, was not limited to Berlin, but it was specific to Berlin the way it was. Johnston County has a long history of knowing what it's like to live under threat. Not quite like that. Different threats, different scales, but the same human question underneath. How do you build a life when you don't know what tomorrow holds? And Sula Hansley figured out one answer. She moved to Four Oaks and got on with it. That's not nothing. In fact, for us, for Joko Yo, that might be everything. Now, if you know Sula Hansley or have heard her tell her story, I want to hear from you. And if by some chance she's listening, I'd love to let her, speak into a microphone, because there are some stories that deserve to be told in the first person, and this is one of them. Drive through Four Oaks today, past the old depot, past the Four Oaks stump site, past the brick storefronts of the historic district. Somewhere in that town is a woman who watched Berlin rebuild itself from ash, who crossed an ocean, who started over in a county full of tobacco fields and sweet tea and people who had probably never heard a Soviet aircraft in their life. She landed here. Stubborn, particular, quietly remarkable, Johnston County took her in. And that's the rest of what we know of Sula Hansley at Four Oaks. Next time, we got something pretty good coming. Try to keep it kind of fresh. And y'all, hope you enjoyed it. Be good.